Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Historian Stamtish. Today we have Dr. Rupert Barrett-Taylor, recently qualified in his field of research, which he's going to tell us about. So, Rupert, please, a short introduction about yourself.
Thank you very much. So yes, I am Rupert Barrett-Taylor. I work as a research fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. I'm lucky enough to be at, should we say, the frontier of the UK's exploration of AI, particularly in the defence and national security domain. So I'm very lucky in that regard. And the recent research direction that we've been taking is looking specifically at the role that AI will play on the battlefield, specifically within command and control, which is a popular theme at the moment. But I think ours is one of the first attempts to think about it specifically in context with the British Army. So that's where we are at the moment.
And a little bit of background on your research, please, before we get into the main paper that you're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So my research, my interest really has always been in kind of, I guess you would call it algorithmic war, or sort of the use of, or the way in which that we conceptualize the use of software, data, algorithms, surveillance technologies, and kind of data and information generally, intelligence on the battlefield. I think there is a lot to be said about for example, the kind of information that makes it onto the battlefield and the kind of information that is insufficiently machine readable to make it onto the battlefield, and what that says about how we understand our opponents. And that's really the kind of theme that of my PhD thesis. And it's also a theme that's of a couple of papers that I've got coming out where I'm starting to think about the kind of split between how the state conceptualizes the technology it uses, and then the difference between that and the private sector that's kind of providing a lot of these technologies now. So that's the kind of direction that I'm kind of moving in.
So, just a little bit more on the background. If I remember rightly from our earlier discussions with Fallout, you were talking about some historical background, some history of technology, history of science, a lot of cybernetic kind of impact, and all of this is encased in your personal experience in work where you've worked with these items. Now, my question to you on this background knowledge is if I'm just an analog user of a telephone, pick it up and ring and dial and all the rest of it, how would you describe what this algorithm war would look like to the average man on the street?
So if you were just somebody who picks up an analog telephone, it would, I suspect if you were stepping forward from the 1950s to the 2025s, actually you wouldn't be that unsurprised about it, because what it really is just a extension of the idea that we build up our enemy as a representation in our minds, and then we decide what the enemy looks like in terms of its vulnerabilities, and then we go forth and we strike them in order to drive them to a point where they would give up fighting in broad terms. But what we've done over decades is layer on top of that all sorts of other technologies that allow us to see the battlefield in more detail. The very tired old metaphor is the panopticon, and it is a very tired metaphor because it doesn't always work in that way. But the idea is the martial community of all sides wants to make the battlefield as transparent as possible so it can deploy its forces most effectively. And the way that we have done that in the sort of NATO alliance is that we've focused very heavily on computation and electronic surveillance, whether that be the processing of like electro-optical sensors, or whether it's processing of signals intelligence, or whether it's processing of any other kind of source of data that we can find on the battlefield. But as time has passed from Second World War to now, the granularity of that surveillance has increased, and thus our ability to create detailed representations of the battlefield has also increased. Now, the argument comes about how accurate those representations are, and because we're going down this path of techno surveillance, there's other forms of information, knowledge about the battlefield. Maybe they get left out. That could be anything from like history, for example, like that doesn't tend to feature too much on the immediate understanding of the battlefield, or things like social cultural data, economic data. All of that stuff tends to be left out of decision making. But a lot of immediate surveillance stuff, the machine can read it very easily. It can be turned around quite quickly. It can be used to speed up decision making, and that's where we focus our attention. And again, whether that's right or not is the bit of which I'm interested in. What data is? Are we reading? Are we getting a good read or sense of the enemy through the methods and processes that we use? And lastly, going into what I'm kind of looking at now, what role does artificial intelligence play in that? Does that allow us to read more data? Possibly. But first, no one has the same, like, okay, so I would argue that no one really understands what they mean by AI. A lot of people talk about it, but actually I don't. I mean, I'm not a technical person in any stretch of the imagination. So I too hold in my mind, the mind palace, a black box which has got AI written on it, and it does magical things. But actually, when you open that box and start to pull things out of it, actually, it's algorithms, it's models, it's data sets, it's processing. There's things that make it more real. So part of my interest as well, just thinking about the future, is unpacking that box to try and make it more real somehow. And there's a lot of other people doing this. So I'm kind of one amongst many, but I am very, my history as a former practitioner, my involvement in the war in Afghanistan, my kind of previous life as a guided weapons engineer, all of those things have kind of led me to be very interested in how we build out the way in which we think about the battlefield.
But that
Yeah,
technical expertise you've had of your past is obviously of value in your research. It's not that you're not a technophobe, it's just that you're now doing you're taking your knowledge and your experience and your education and taking it in a different direction. Is that a fair impression?
I think so. I think so. I think the trajectory of my career has taken me through lots of different communities, and I think the thing that I find really interesting is how different communities mobilize technology in different ways and how they refer to it in different ways. Um, but certainly, the military community is very, I would say, they have a strong belief that technology will change things, and I guess it kind of does, but not in a straightforward way. It's not a linear. So again, harking forward slightly to the paper, I don't think something like artificial intelligence produces like a linear resource saving. Like one of the things that people like technology to do is speed things up and make them more efficient. So you think about cybernetic decision cycles. The idea of artificial intelligence in that space is to make everything faster. Like we'll make better and quicker decisions, and we can therefore use resources more effectively, and therefore we don't need we need less mass within perhaps our own force structures. I would say that linear path towards resource savings is not quite as linear as maybe people think, because technology is mobilized in support of all sorts of things, not just military goals. And what I think is interesting is unpacking that. What are we saying? What is this technology for? What are we actually doing with it? Do we need it? Is it useful? Well, not always. It's not always as useful as we think it's going to be. And I think my uneven trajectory towards academia in that regard has been kind of helpful.
The the very famous book, and I now have forgotten the author, which is just typical at this stage, The Social History of the Machine Gun, seemed to imply as soon as the machine gun was developed, and of course at that time barbed wire and all other kinds of things, militaries went from the art of war to technology will save us. And
Yeah.
you seem to be saying that that idea of war is still central to military thinking.
Yeah, I think so. Although there's a paper that I've got, hopefully is going to come out soonish, still in review. But I'm where I've been trying to think about the relationship between something like process, because everyone loves a process, right? Particularly in the armed forces, we do love a process because it makes things regular, it makes things predictable. It's good for kind of training purposes, good for kind of education purposes. We train on a standardized model. But that means there's a nice relationship there between the tech sector and the armed forces, and they can get on with each other because both sides love love a process and they like enabling everything with technology. So you get this lovely kind of cozy relationship between tech and armed forces, military leaders, because both see the value of a process. The danger, I think, is coming to the point where private sector mobilization of process has a very particular economic connotation, which there is a strong argument to be made that that kind of de-skills industries. And so the thing that's in my mind is that the more we go down the tech, the more the kind of the alignment happens between private sector and the armed forces. The thing that worries me slightly is that you'll get this you'll get this de-skilling within the kind of the armed forces and the military kind of the sort of the martial expertise. That martial distinctiveness will start to erode because we'll get to the point where everything is so process tech driven in the model of the kind of your Fordist Taylorist kind of process that you start to de-skill, and that strikes me as not being a particularly good application of technology in the armed forces, particularly when we need smart people who know when to make judgments when the tech doesn't work. So anyway, that for me, that kind of tension is at the heart of like the my own research interests. Like, how do you kind of navigate your way through mobilization of tech, knowing what you're actually trying to do with it, knowing what the complicated consequences of it are, and knowing what other people are trying to do with the tech. Yeah.
But then there becomes another issue, doesn't there, where the tech is taken by the field commander as a war-winning weapon,
Yeah.
and it's used to such an extent that the war-winningness eventually fades away when the competitor, the rival, the enemy, decides that it can counter this war-winning weapon, and then there's no solution and there's no thinking through the system of how to resolve this problem. And what you kind of reminded me of was the time when there was talk in Britain of going private with the logistics supplies and everything else. And there was this great fear amongst senior officers who would speak at Royal United Service Institute, saying this will hollow out the capability of troops to supply themselves, run ordnance and all of that. And I suspect now, given what's happened in Germany, trying to fill in the gaps of having hollowed out its armed forces, that the British Armed Forces are in a similar situation, trying badly to catch up with a hollowed out past.
I think that's right. I think there's a sort of danger of leaping to technical solutions because I mean one of the other things that's on my mind is that drones are kind of being talked about as the war-winning weapon. There's a lot of focus on them, but I think it's again not that straightforward. I don't think it's quite the linear path to like capability, war-winning weapon, as perhaps it's showcased in certain areas. I think there's definitely like they are useful, but they also have limits, right? And so what are their limitations? How do we construct a sensible doctrine around the use of drones? And one of the things that's very interesting to me that I haven't yet got a chance to do anything with is that the drone itself, it works as a, what do we call it? You can't have the drone without the infantry. There's no point because the drone exists to destroy the infant. So you need the infant. So how does that?
People suddenly realised with the bombing campaign in the Second World War that if you don't have troops on the ground, all you're doing is creating rubble, and the enemy
Yes.
continues fighting. It was a
Yes.
huge shock for people, but you'd be astonished. What struck me as odd about the drone story, and here I'm saying I don't get interested in modern war anymore because of the way things have gone, but I looked at the House of Lords paper on the war in Ukraine, and I noticed that the drone lobby had dominated the paper, and I just thought then, oh my goodness, we're in another similar situation. We bounce from the Maginot Line to the greatness of the bomber to the panzer troops, all the way through, right the way through to maneuver warfare. Was there such a thing as Auftragstactik, mission command? I mean, the whole kit and caboodle has now ended up with doing the drone. And it's almost like somebody needs to write a book about all the seriously silly ideas that have come forward and are not war-winning weapons, and they haven't won the war, and they haven't decided anything.
Well, so just as you were talking, like a tangent occurred to me, which is that what can we take? What can we draw from the missile lobby of the 60s and 70s? You know,
Yeah.
what was it? What lessons can we draw around? And the thing that, because again, I had a brief dalliance with being a kind of weapons engineer. The One of the interesting things about Vietnam, for example, was the Phantom entered the conflict armed entirely with missiles because the future of missiles was going to be long distance engagement with, we didn't need a gun. And about not very long into the Vietnam War, we discovered dogfighting was still a thing. And you can go down the movie Top Gun route around that if you want to. But I think the really interesting thing for me was like the BVR engagement, where you couldn't use a BVR weapon in a contested environment because you need to close to identify the target first. So that drew you into the kind of the dogfighting, the within visual range kind of engagement, because you had to do that anyway. So then you end up with gun pods and then retrofitting later Phantoms with guns. So what can we learn from that? Is there something we can talk about in terms of automation and talking about like needing to actually see humans on the battlefield before we engage? What lesson? And I don't feel like I've seen, for example, again, I'm thinly read, but if there was something to be written about that, I would say that it would probably be quite a useful thing to reflect on. Again, coming back to the point about Cold War history.
Well, I think, you look at how companies exploited war. You only have to look at the way Hawker and Fairey and the aviation companies carried on producing what can only be said to be substandard aircraft for the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, knowing full well that there were better aircraft, but were not prepared to license their facilities to build those aircraft because they were making too much money out of the junk that they were selling to the British government. I mean, this is a forever cycle. Some companies exploited the situation, others didn't. You can't just say capitalism was all at fault when a country goes to war.
No,
It's just different people at different times doing either acceptable things or not. Um, War profiteers. I still think we haven't really got our head around what war profiteers are. Um,
but again, like the fun thing about treating technology is just the sort of a thing around which orbits and is orbited by lots of different constituencies of people getting stuff from it. Like, um, is that you can make points like that and say that it's not so, there's not like what it's not black and white. It's not like a binary kind of it's this fault or this fault. It's actually a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this, and actually taken together, that's why you get the tech performing a certain role for different people. And things like the missile lobby of the late Cold War, I think, is probably a great example of that. People were getting different things from being able to say, you don't need guns, you actually need this advanced technology to do, because then you start to build an ecosystem around it and you get lots of interests and stuff developing around it. But when it doesn't work, then the fallout from that takes many years to then resolve itself, particularly as you spent this tend to happen around very expensive technology, which then takes a lot of time to recoup recoup the losses from, maybe.
well, it was very funny back in those days. I still remember the debate. France decided to place all its tactical nuclear missiles along the Rhine, which meant 75 miles away was landing in Germany. So, and I remember those debates, and people were concentrating on the cruise missile coming from America to Britain, and there was all this fuss about making Britain a target. But for 20 years, the French had been making Germany a target, which of course would have wafted into Britain and killed British forces as well. I mean, it was remarkable how many people didn't really focus on what the heck was going on. and yet this missile debate was, oh, we've got to have more missiles. There was more and more missiles, and nobody was actually talking about where these missiles were actually going to land.
What is it they do? So
It's
the missiles are
amazing.
symbolic. There's a symbolism to the technology, which then obfuscates all this other stuff that's going on around the edges of them. And I think the same goes for the tech that I'm so interested in, the kind of the softwares, the data-led tech that I'm interested in. There's a symbology to it. There's a kind of the totemic in certain ways, of a certain kind of way of being. And I think, again, one of the interesting things for me is how that the constituencies around the tech themselves all carry with them a particular conception of what they think war is going to look like. And whether that is the same as what maybe the army at the front line think it's going to be is kind of up for debate. How the different categories that they assign to the battlefield, whether that be what a target looks like, whether that be like what they think a soldier is, or what, warrior discourse and all this kind of stuff. You can see there's fault lines around the tech that are kind of they're getting into the conversations about, okay, so what does a future battlefield look like and what should be in it? And that stuff gets, we lose some of that detail when we focus on the object, the technology itself, whether it's the drone, whether it's the box with AI written on it, whatever it is. I think the danger is that we lose the nuance, the sort of the discourse that's going on around the object, because that's kept at arm's length as we're talking about the performance of the system.
Well, I think it's very interesting that in the Ukraine war, Russia has piled in all this junk and absorbed NATO technology.
Yes.
And instead of addressing that situation, which is one of the things we looked at in Putin's war, people have tried to address it by going further down the technology route. And it strikes me very interesting that with all the discussions that are going on about how, quote, Russia's going to lose this war, and focus on that, and at the same time focus on artificial intelligence, there doesn't seem to be that much concentration on how those expensive NATO weapons were literally wasted in combat situations, and the Russians are still in the field. Now that surely has an impact on NATO long term.
I suppose one way of looking at it is that the Russians have successfully used their like depth of rubbish that they've kept sort of hanging about in various places as a great way of like buying time to rearm. I mean, not that I'm saying they're successfully rearming or anything, but they're trends. I don't know. Maybe you would disagree with this, but like they seem to be rebuilding their economy around kind of war output, right? So that I've heard that argued. That seems like a sensible argument. And if that's the case, then you could probably argue that they shoved all the rubbish forward. They've used that to buy sufficient time in order to reconfigure their economy, which then says that in the next few years, then that newer stuff will start to come online. And NATO are going to be forced to do the same thing, presumably, in order to kind of counter it. So there's a although it seemed like shoving T-54s into the front or T-62s to the front line seems like madness. There is a kind of madness to the madness, which is then arming, reconstituting factories and alliances in the background in order to kind of then bring stuff through again, I guess.
Well, it's very interesting. The Russians use the term maskirovka, which is to disguise things and to disguise and cloak the war. And one of the situations in June 1941, the Germans faced all this junk. There was a few heavy tanks, but mostly the Soviet Red Army had a load of junk. And suddenly, round about November, December, they started to face T-34s. And there wasn't just a few of them, there was an awful lot of them. And they suddenly turned up. And there's even a point in the history where Hitler admits to the Finnish prime minister or president, we undercounted, we miscounted and calculated the scale of the Russian power. And I think what's actually happened again is the Soviet mentality has continued, which is actually just standard Russian mentality. We'll get rid of the junk first and then we'll use the new. But I think also at the same time, you're correct, and it's a powerful observation that the Russians are transferring their economy from the chaos and the disorder that was well known, that came out of the horror of the 1990s, and are streamlining it towards a military industrial complex to compete with America and to a lesser extent Europe. The point is they're getting too much. They're getting a huge amount of backing from China and India, so it's a very conceivable project. And I think Western politicians and defence experts, that kind of thing goes over their head because they really back to bean counters. Well, if they've got 100 tanks and we've got 200 tanks, we're going to win. They miss the actual change of military culture in Russian society.
But so I have thoughts about this as well, because again, I think that comes back to this idea that we there's a real focus on management, right? Like the UK and a lot of other countries are very oriented towards the output of services, and a lot of those services are management consultancy type services. And I think there's a real emphasis on like that kind of quantitative understanding of or comparative quantitative understanding. I think that's a kind of real driver for our whole economy, that kind of mentality. But again, that what is that going to be the right thing to do to try? Do we manage war or do we fight war, or what do we do? We don't. I would argue you don't manage a war. You have to kind of fight it, and you have to really kind of be. You have to take more things into account than quantifying everything. And it comes back to the point about like the historical and like the arc of history that we're in, and the point about the Cold War again. The mass versus technological advantage. Is it the third? I never remember I get this phrase right or not. The third offset strategy, like this idea that we are going to offset the Soviet mass with surveillance, centralized targeting, getting things before they hit the battlefield, etc., etc. It feels like that again. If we're on the arc of history, it feels like we're back into familiar ground where we're kind of thinking about like offsetting the threat of Russian mass with deep fires, hitting beyond the battlefield, all those kind of questions. But just to pick up on one final point, I think your point about Hitler and misreading or misunderstanding or not understanding the Russians, the strength of the Russian economy and their ability to reconstitute the history of targeting, thinking about the Second World War to the future, ultimately it is kind of undergirded by human experiences. Like in the Second World War, like the strategic bombing was not at all computerized. And so it was all human judgment. We sort of looked at German economy and using people banging their heads together, deconstituted it into things that we thought we could strike that would have strategic effect. But it's human judgment. And I think we still do that. It's just we have computers as well to tell us whether we're right or not. But we shouldn't forget the fact that all the stuff that goes into the back end of an AI is still founded ultimately on human judgment. And so what we see as vulnerabilities, they may not well be. How do we? It's not just objective, rational, logical process. We have informed a model that we believe this is how a vulnerability is, and the model tells us where those vulnerabilities sort of manifest in data, right? So it's very human judgment. So I don't believe the idea that tech is able to help us strategically fight a war, because I still think to a certain extent we need to acknowledge the fact that the judgment calls are going to have to be made about how we actually, which bits of this system are the actual vulnerabilities, and we have to decide what that is. So people have to take responsibility for that. We can't.
I think it's very interesting you citing that example, because if you look at the Admiralty, they employed operational research guys with a naval background.
Yeah.
And if you spoke to anybody who'd been on the naval side of operationals research in the U-boat war, they were very certain of what they were doing and why they were able to identify the potential target areas where the U-boats were going to collect, because they were not only using the computations of operational research to plot out what could happen, but they were putting a naval mindset against it.
Yeah.
interestingly, on the Royal Air Force side, they had mathematicians who were trying to plot numbers against known factors.
Yep.
Problem was they could get to 75% of known factors, and then they had to throw in assumptions
Yep.
to fill the space. Um, and it's very interesting that filling that space, many of their assumptions eventually were wrong
Yep.
because the calculation wasn't complete.
So this is where I don't like operational research.
I know you
It
don't. That's
annoys
why I
me.
raised it.
It intensely annoys me because it's been conflated with all sorts of other things, right? So that U-boat example is fabulous. It's wonderful because it's a lovely example of a closed system that's very simple to kind of map out and very straightforward. Well, I'm going to say that and everyone's going to shout at me. You can define variables that enable you to kind of map and represent that as a problem. And there's this real conflation of systems, networks, closed systems, open systems. We've got to the point where everything's flattened and operational research is treated as just being like a panacea for all of these things, whether they're open or closed systems, to the point where like there is an argument in literature between the cybernetics and open systems people because they don't do the same thing. And the assumptions you're talking about are kind of, they're kind of nudging on the door of like, well, how do you map an open system and like make it useful for operational research? Well, the answer is you can't really, because you were trying to kind of obfuscate and hide the assumptions you're making by either simplifying it too much or getting it wrong because you've had to acknowledge it's an open system. And I think I don't know what you do about that, apart from I think it's important to take responsibility rather than try to hide behind method. Like, okay, I've decided I think this is the way it works. I'm going to sign my name here and say this is me. I've decided this is because my expertise says this is how it works. And you do that by knowing things like history, like talking to a lot of people, maybe at the front line of a conflict. It's the human experience of warfare is really important to kind of make judgments about how we're going to fight it. And I really feel like operational research, and here's where I'm going to get shouted at, is an opportunity to hide behind method in order to evade responsibility for the human perception or like acknowledging the human experience of war.
Well, I found
Yeah,
that I find I entirely agree with you. I mean, I've told you before in the past that I was trained under Stafford Beer's
right.
cybernetics modeling when I was at business school. So my understanding of operational research is very much defined towards a cybernetic modeling. But when I spoke to Maurice Kirby, who wrote many of the histories of cybernetics and organizational research, it didn't seem to be able to take on board that there was only a limitation. There was only so far you could go with operational research, that it wasn't the panacea for everything. It wasn't the
Yes.
solution to everything. There was only so far you could go. And I think that's the same with anything. And I'm hoping now, when we're coming close now to talking about your paper, when you present your paper, I think it's very interesting to think that there is no one idea, that
Yes.
we win wars by lots of ideas coming together with lots of weapons to beat the crap out of the enemy.
Yes. I think that's right. I think the sort of trying really, really hard to get away from the attritional nature of warfare. I understand the impulse because no one wants to. Yeah, I understand the impulse post Second World War. People must have been like, we do not want to fight that kind of war again. No, thank you. And so looking for any way to try and avoid having to fight an awful kind of attritional based war with, a global attritional war. People again are probably going to shout at me for calling the Second World War attritional. I'm generalizing massively, but I think every war we have fought in the intervening period has ended up with a certain degree of committing large numbers of troops who have suffered large amounts of casualties and then brought that back to the homeland, and that's had all sorts of consequences. So I feel like we acknowledging the human role of war and how it can have all sorts of both frontline and immediate effects in terms of mass and holding ground, and also acknowledging that committing to a war which has a lot of people in it has consequences for your own country because they bring back with them the experience of war into society. And So I think that the cybernetics thing, if I were to think about like expanding it into, well, war as an open system, war as an open system that includes the homeland, it includes the international system. All of these things have unknowable consequences. But if you cut them out because you're just very focused on a narrow problem from the battlefield, you are basically just stacking up problems for yourself in the future, in my opinion. And I think that's what's kind of come out of maybe the global war on terror, but that's maybe a different conversation.
Probably, and I would say I think a lot of it is to do with closed loops and closed feedback, which never comes back into the system, and therefore people don't learn from what they've got, what's gone on, and that's the problem. Now,
Yeah,
I'm going to
right.
cut it.
Paper.
We have done a typical historian Stamtish so far, which is to talk about everything that we're not supposed
Sorry,
to
I
talk about.
just got gone off
But
like
the
this.
beauty of it is we've chilled out, we've got going. So now I think it's over to you to talk about your paper. I'm not going to interrupt. If you want to have a Q&A afterwards, we can do, and we can talk about reception and buzzwords and all of that good stuff. But I think
Yeah.
it's time for you to deliver your paper, and I will sit here quietly and bite my tongue.
Okay. So noting all the preamble that I just did, I recently co-authored a paper for the Alan Turing Institute called AI Won't Replace the General, Algorithms, Decision-Making and Battlefield Command. I co-authored it with my colleague, Natasha Kana. And the point of the paper was to, so we were lucky enough to get some funding from Accenture to do this piece of work around, well, how does AI fit into the battlefield? So there was a bit of, what do we mean by that? And what is fairly clear to me is that there's a lot of strategic discussions about AI in the battlefield, which is, doing a lot of this. And then there's a lot of very detailed conversations about what you might do at a very small level of the battlefield to kind of better understand the sort of tactical battle. But what I haven't seen is trying to connect the two. Okay, so how does the AI actually fit into a battle space that connects the strategic to the tactical? And that's the impulse that drove me towards this. And I started typically for me, because I do enjoy a process, I started with the 7 questions. So the combat estimate, because I wanted a frame to hang some of this stuff around. So if AI is going to be sat in a command post, presumably it will have to be at least related to the 7 questions combat estimate process at some level in order to kind of get it into a command post. So I started with that. Very grateful to all the people in the British Army and sort of connected that I interviewed to talk to about this. And the thing that came clear to me, reading both doctrine and talking to people, is that you have this real challenge of the brigade to battle group kind of command post being everything from a single vehicle through to a fixed installation. And that the implication of that is you need a huge amount of flexibility. If you're going to have a box with AI written on it, it's going to have to be a box that goes from a very small box to being a very large box, depending on where you need it to be and how many people you need to be able to use it. And then there's the sort of challenge of, okay, so you have your box called with AI written on it, and it's in your vehicle, but you've only got the one vehicle with the commander. Does the commander need it at that point? Or actually, does the box with AI written on it need to be back 2 miles, sort of sat in a more secure installation? And if so, how does the commander draw a line between it and their own view of the battlefield at the front line? So what tasks does it do? How does the commander relate to it? How do they draw information from it? Does it do courses of action, or does it just enable staff work? So again, the missing piece here is where, but also how, which, these feel like big questions to me. Like there's big stuff in here, big uncertainty about like, okay, so what, does it replace all the staff, or do you still need the staff for redundancy in resilience? Because another, as you'll be well aware, looking at Ukraine, it's a horrible battle. Like the battle space is an awful place to be. Like you're constantly being targeted. There's artillery all over the show. There's drones. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And if you're a sensible commander, you might well just switch your radios off because you don't want to be targeted, or you're worried you're going to be targeted. And therefore, the next question is, well, how do you keep your models synced so everyone's on the same metaphorical page? Can you even use it? Do you actually have to turn your generators off as well, so the box gets switched off and you're back to grease pencils and maps? Like, what I'm trying to paint here is this picture of the box marked AI sat on the battlefield with a huge amount of uncertainty around it in terms of how to make it fit and work. Because the British Army doesn't yet have the infrastructure at the front line to be able to kind of do wideband communications to keep, theoretically, if we were to have a model in every vehicle, an AI box in every vehicle, and then there's the question of like, what data do you need to understand the battlefield? Are we talking here about surveillance data, or going back to our earlier conversation, how much do you need to know that's qualitative and ephemeral and kind of relates to the intent of the enemy on the other side of the valley or the other side of the hill? How are they going to get to you? What are they going to do? So the data demands are quite large as well, and keeping those data sets up to date so they reflect our current and best understanding in a context of switching the radio off all the time and you only having access to the box periodically and all the uncertainty that goes with it means that you can see how complicated you go from this clever idea of like enabling the commander with a box that tells them to go there, or the enemy's over there. But actually you end up with a massive amount of complexity. And one of the things that I also drew from Matt Ford's research actually was just thinking about if you're going to start incorporating large volumes of like open source data, for example, you're creating vulnerabilities for yourself, not just because can you trust the data that you're using when it's outside of the kind of government sponsored domain? And is it making you vulnerable to deception and all sorts of other things? And then there's the kind of on the transparent, battlefields that Matt outlines in his book. Are you just at constant risk of being surveilled yourself? And do you have to keep track of that as well through your command post activity? There's all sorts of ways in which the kind of information domain, the kind of tech domain that the British Army is moving into is going to theoretically produce efficiency savings in terms of when everything does work, you can automatically generate all the staff work and therefore everyone can concentrate on more important tasks. But there's all these new vulnerabilities and new kind of things that might generate more work because you're having to manage your data more effectively, even at the front line. So for me, there's challenges here that we've tried to kind of outline in this paper. And the last point is the one that I'm kind of really interested in as well, is that when let's say we eventually settle on the box with AI written on it, and we know what it does, and everyone's clear about what responsibilities it has, where it fits into process. Maybe it does course of action generation. It's really involved in the day-to-day of warfare. How does the commander feel about that? Like, does that actually affect how we think about leadership? Like, so is in 10 years' time, let's say, is the British Army going to be confronting a crisis of like skills loss and like a crisis of the leadership because it is trying to kind of relate to this new tech that's taking away some of the things that a commander might have taken as being like the defining characteristics, independence, autonomy, red trousers, whatever. There's a sort of, how is it going to affect the way that the British Army thinks about itself? And those are the bits that I'm kind of really, bearing in mind where I've kind of my trajectory, that's the thing I'm really interested in. I know Anthony King's written a book that I got to digest and kind of read properly. Came out roughly the same time as this paper, but I think we're all kind of, you can see where people are kind of starting to take the ephemera of AI in the battlefield and start to make it more real by saying, we need to put boxes around this stuff slightly to make it work. And one of the key challenges really, coming back to the box with AI written on it, is unpacking that box and making things real. So if we can start to like elicit tasks that we might want to automate, for example, we can then start to, if we take from the box particular models or particular ways of machine learning, it could be really simple. It could just be like old school machine learning kind of models that we use to automate particular tasks. That's not really AI, but we call it AI now. So when we unpack this box, we might find simple ways in which to kind of relieve the burden of staff work and command, as well as more complicated chatbots that can help with courses of action. But until we do that and align it to the tasks that go on within a command post, we won't know, and we won't know what it is that we need to do. And there's doesn't feel like there's a one size fits all box that we can just adopt. It's going to be quite mission specific, quite theatre specific. Yeah, so for me, it's been kind of an interesting exploration. Like, okay, so making it real is quite hard. With every technology, I think that's right. Like making the observation that bringing any technology into the front line is hard is the right observation. But I think you can start to see the kind of things that need to be done first, and it's starting with going to um, you know brigade commanders and their staff and being like, okay, what do you need? What do you want? And I know, just to fully acknowledge, I know there's teams working on this sort of stuff. So I'm not I'm not revealing anything like, wow, this is brand new and magical. But I think, hopefully the paper that we've written has helped to kind of bring some of these things into one place and put it in the public domain so that the conversation can be had around it. So yeah, that's the paper.
My first question when I read your paper is, and this is going to be a bit tough, this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is who's it meant for?
It's a good question. It was really meant to be pointed at, well, firstly, it was pointed at the British Army to say, hopefully you recognize some of these challenges and you can kind of point at the paper and then use that to facilitate discussion with some people that you need to kind of do stuff for you. So it was designed to generate conversation between partners. And secondly, it was also designed to provoke like research agendas, because I think this foundational stuff about how does command work, I think it's all written down in various places, but it needs to be kind of brought closer to the kind of the technologists of the world, so that we can make the battlefield like go from a kind of idea of what Ukraine looks like, for example, and kind of like make it real in the sense that we want to kind of find problems for the technology to solve. Because at the moment, again, going back to the point I made about there's lots of small picture stuff and lots of big picture stuff, but not a lot of connecting material. I think what we're trying to point at to the research community in general is the shape of things that need to be addressed. So we need to go and do this stuff. We can't ignore it. We need to go and understand what the army really needs.
Okay, so forget the research element at the moment. So let's say the British Army. Who in the British Army? It's certainly not Lance Corporal Jones in the catering corps, is it?
No.
This has a mission command of its own, and it is targeted directly at somebody. And I'd like to know who, because I think you know who you're targeting. If you don't want to say so, I'll
No, so I mean,
but I think I know who you're targeting.
Well, so the obvious people that will be the audience for this that might find it useful are like our deployable headquarters, right? So that's the ARC, and I can never remember, is it 1 div or 3 div? Anyway, the brain fart, but it's the deployable bit of the army, the deployable headquarters bit of the army,
the bit because that goes out and fights. Let's just be
yes.
So the bit that goes out to fight is the one that you're aiming to talk
yes.
to. Right.
It is the deployable part of at the moment, it's the deployable part of the army, because they're the bits that are going to be the ones that are going to be asked to adopt this technology first. Obviously, because they're the ones that are going to kind of be presumably deployed to the field along with our allies. So this is a kind of, effectively, this paper is just a reflection of a broader conversation that's also happening in NATO and across kind of NATO member nations, right? So everyone's having this conversation about artificial intelligence. It doesn't feel like a conversation which is like, should we? It's more of a conversation of how at this point. So noting that this is kind of pointed at the front line to say, here's some things that you need to do. We might need to think about understanding before you try and do the integration thing. And it's also pointed at like communities that we've spoken to, like Army Futures, for example, like that, these are all communities that are kind of thinking about these problems going forward, and at the kind of front line of adoption.
So given that the divisional commanders and the brigade commanders are in a difficult position with limited resources, huge pressures, multiple tasks, unable to have the resources to commit to all of these tasks. Have they got the capability of responding to you?
I mean, that
I'm
that
not,
is,
I'm not saying whether they're clever or capable. Are they
yeah,
in
yeah.
a
No, I
position
hear
where
you.
they can respond?
So in terms of bandwidth, I think no, but it's coming. Like in the sense that the SDR and the kind of the emphasis of the Strategic Defence Review that came out this year really is on make this kind of happen. And things like the digital targeting web, which is a sort of sub, not subfield, that's the wrong way of putting it. There is a relationship between something like a digital targeting web and a kind of AI enabled command and control system because they will be drawing on similar things to do similar things. Um, that is an aspiration for the army and the armed forces in general. So it's coming. Like this is resources are going to be allocated to do some of this stuff in some form. So although not now, probably in future. And there's, I think, the trajectory of the strategic defense review, thinking about something like a digital targeting web in 2027, I think you can see there's going to be suddenly like scaling up is going to be a big deal. Like suddenly having to go from thinking about this as something which will happen in the future at some point to being like, oh God, we need to do it now. They're going to scale quickly, and therefore here's some things to think about as you scale. Here, tasks to roll, etc.
I took that from your paper and from your talk, that infrastructure was central to this discussion about how they're going to go forward. But now let's look at the brigade commander, the divisional commander in another scenario. Um, you talked about if we embrace this kind of science, this artificial intelligence, it actually makes, as Matt Ford has discussed several times in his books and papers, it's actually making the commanders even more obvious targets. So will they be trained to become a target, or will they be trained to avoid being a target, in your opinion?
So I would say there's a couple of things. The first is they're going to need to train the demands of situational awareness are, I imagine, going to grow considerably because it feels like a frontline commander is going to be asked to manage their online presence and manage and be aware of to what extent they're being surveilled by smartphones in the ether, right? So I feel like there's going to be a training requirement down the line and maybe even a staff requirement, who knows, in order to manage their own a subunit's kind of visibility somehow. I mean, I don't know what form that will take.
So you somehow got to find a balance, haven't you? To isolate the commander, but make the commander more obvious to the troops.
Yes.
It's a bizarre balance. You need to isolate him from potential of being a target and being taken out, and at
Yeah.
the same time raising his profile so he's leading the operations through artificial intelligence to make the army more aggressive, lethal, and winning.
Yeah. I mean, you raised an interesting point about general vulnerability of a commander. So, like a divisional commander, a brigade commander, but if they have a substantial online um, presence, for example, it might make them vulnerable to effects in the homeland. And this is not something that I think is like beyond the bounds of possibility in a future war. So you raise an interesting point about both battlefield vulnerability and also like more situated contextual vulnerability of like senior commanders and their families and everything else in the kind of the what might constitute a future war, battlefield from frontline to homeland. And I think that feels like that's quite an important point to take away from all of this, even if it's slightly outside of the kind of the debate about what AI does on the front line. There is a question about whether we should, I guess there's a question implicit to that about whether you can use AI to kind of identify your own vulnerabilities personal vulnerabilities, the commander's personal responsibilities in the sort of the homeland based on their kind of online presence and so on and so forth.
Now, let's think about leadership culture, because the other thing that I read from your paper is leadership culture. And while you're very modernistic and future thinking, and correctly so, because I think we need more of that and less looking at the history, I think there is a moment where we have to look back on the history, and that is the history of leaders and commanders in war have, for one way or another, put themselves out there. And I don't just mean Rommel running around in his scout car being shot at by fighter planes or all of that stuff. I'm talking about proper generals who actually put themselves into a position like Walter Model was just happened to be in the Arnhem area when the Allies dropped, but stayed in that battle area and controlled the battle and at the same time controlled another battle taking place at Arkham. And I think that being close and present to the fighting was also obvious with some of the British and American generals in recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm thinking now, that culture, is that culture going to change or is it going to adapt? How do you see that, see what's happening?
I feel like the easy answer is that that's up for debate, but I think the right answer is that the technology should enable the commander to stay close to the front line, because I mean it's written in doctrine. The kind of the way in which leadership and command is kind of spoken about within doctrine kind of emphasizes the need for the commander to be flexible and kind of stay close to the front line where it's useful and appropriate. And I think that is important. I don't think it's going to be possible to replace the instinctual idea, or it's the right word. I don't really know what the right word is for it, but that kind of the sense that a commander gets from the front line, like the kind of the go flying by the seat of your pants, kind of understanding what's going on, being able to see that moment to moment, see how maybe your soldiers are doing, like understand how the battle's going, getting that real connection to the battlefield itself. I don't think that should go away. I feel like you can't replace that. And so my instinct is that any AI tooling has to enable that rather than replace it. So it shouldn't be like the commander can now sit in a helicopter above the battlefield while the AI tells them what's important. I think the AI needs to kind of present certain information that they might not have access to as they're looking at the battlefield rather than replace it. Again, the point about like someone else pointed out to us that the kind of the tagline about military genius in the report is a kind of ego. That's right. I think it's more making a point about the old school kind of Clausewitzian war studies conception of what the fight is about remains, and it still feels like it's important. And I think we're not going to replace military genius or the kind of the training that you give to a leader before they go to the battlefield with an artificial intelligence. I don't think that's the way it works. Should be about enablement rather than replacement.
Okay, so you've mentioned Clausewitz, and I'm not going to go down the route of being positive or negative towards Clausewitz. But there is this idea that somehow if you read his book, you are close to genius once you're a battlefield commander. And so now I'm going to ask you, what if artificial intelligence renders Clausewitz redundant? It's a hypothetical question. It's not meant to say, oh, in detail, the fog of war doesn't go away, the friction doesn't go away. I'm just saying what happens, and we know this is happening in history now with books disappearing because they're not digitalized.
Yeah.
What happens when Clausewitz disappears and we only have artificial intelligence? Are you there?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking about that. Like, because
I thought for a
sorry
second
that I
he's
mean,
gone.
no, it's still here. Just like thrown by like Clausewitz, not there anymore. Like, what our anchor, the sort of the thing that holds us all to the battlefield. If that goes, what will I think? I think there is a danger that um, throughout our discussion, we've talked a bit about like kind of needing to kind of remind ourselves about the arc of history. And I think that Clausewitz is less about the actual material book and more about anchoring ourselves to the arc of history. So anchoring ourselves to a conception of what the military does and what the leadership does for the battlefield, how um, we think about ourselves in terms of kind of a collective, I say we, not me, how the military command thinks of itself collectively as a kind of institution, right? So Clausewitz is less about the text and more about the anchoring, I think. And so if we were to say that Clausewitz goes away in favor of AI, then you would think that I guess you're kind of implying that AI then becomes the anchor for military identity. And that doesn't feel right somehow, because particularly when you think about like a chat GPT, it wants to please you, right? It infinitely tells you nice. My experience, I mean, this is something that I've read and heard people argue that, you know, the chatbot is just an infinitely agreeable thing that will keep patting you on the head and saying well done, no matter how many complicated questions you ask it. And so the thing about being anchored to an arc of history is that it gives you examples of both good and bad practice, and I don't think AI can do that. Certainly not as we understand it now. AI is a tool that enables you to access data sets that tell you about the battlefield. They don't tell you about your identity and the role that you expect to play on the battlefield. And I think that's the bit that's really important.
Well,
Uh,
let's assume that we're in the next generations and people have been brought up with ChatGPT and all of these other things, and Clausewitz is now dead, and all they've got is regurgitated ChatGPT.
yeah.
How is the future commander able to discern between good information coming, and I'm going to use the basics, good information coming in on artificial intelligence and bad? How is he going to distinguish between the two and make the correct decision? Or is he going to allow artificial intelligence to decide which is the best decision and go with that?
So that's a so there's I know what the people who are more technically minded than me would want to suggest that the box of AI written on it would be sufficiently explainable that it would present the commander with both the information that they're interested in, but also enable somehow it to explain the sources it's used, why it's used them, and what somehow probably some sort of probabilistic assessment of, you know, how good the various different data sources are and how the overall conclusion is constructed. So one of the things is then the explainability thing. That's something that can be done. But how people use information, I think and here I am, this is me talking about myself now, because I haven't read very thoroughly into this particular subject. But I think there's a number of different studies which suggest that reliance on ChatGPT, current kind of chatbot in it, like artificial intelligence technologies, doesn't help your decision making process. It weakens your ability to make judgment calls around the kind of information you're using. It erodes your decision making ability. Um, so I would say that um, we would need to. What does that mean? What that probably means is that the context of training a commander will have to include, you need to be aware of what this is going to do to you. And then it also needs to reflect, we can't lose the Clausewitzian anchor. Forget Clausewitz for a moment. Let's just think about the existing training syllabus,
Call
the
it
kind of
Germany,
reversionary,
right?
anything like
Doesn't matter.
the sum total of kind of the training syllabus is that the officers get in their various kind of staff courses. All of that needs to stay put, and all the reversionary modes of like fighting a war needs to stay put, because otherwise it's unclear, and it seems to be it seems to be possible that you relying on a chat bot interface will actually erode the commander's ability to do their job effectively. So a balance is going to need to be struck. And again, it comes back to the point about support. How do you make sure that you're doing something useful to the commander rather than eroding what the commander does on the battlefield?
If the commander is trained in both automatic warfare and analog warfare, and he gets into a situation where he so relies on automatic warfare that he's become so happy with it, he just accepts everything that's piling through, and suddenly there is a crisis. How would he be able to overcome that if he's trusted the artificial intelligence? The level of trust that a human being gives to another human being will be passed to an AI app or whatever, and that level of trust is generated, and he relies on those decisions. I mean, we're a bit like the fail-safe or the Doctor Strangelove scenario. Um, at which point does he say, "Actually, I've got to switch this off"?
Well, I mean, that's a. I don't. So I would hope. Again, we're kind of into my hopes now, rather than like anything I can point to. But I would hope that there's going to come a point around which the technology becomes settled and boring, and it stops being the kind of the laser focus of everyone's attention, and it starts becoming part of the metaphorical furniture. At that point, I'm hoping that a more settled social infrastructure will emerge around it, in which we understand where it's good, where it's bad, and where we need to kind of retain relationships with other people. At the moment, I think there's everything's very unsettled. I mean, the conversation we're having at the moment is very kind of reflective of the fact that AI is very unsettled technology. We haven't The box with AI on it is a metaphorical box, and we don't really understand it properly. And until it becomes part of the furniture, we're not going to understand like the consequences on notions of command, except that there probably will be some. But then once we understand what the box is and what effect it has, then we will be able to then backfill that with things that enable us to overcome that particular weakness and limitation. Hopefully, I'm hoping that humans will reassert the human dimension of war will reassert itself in the next few years, where the technology of like drones and artificial intelligence will fade backwards slightly, because we'll remember what the battlefield is and what's on it, and we'll remember what war is and who fights it, and we'll start to think a bit more about AI just being part of the furniture, and we still need to do other things. In fact, I mean, I've spoken to like several people around this particular subject who talk a lot about reversionary stuff. They're noting that all the radios are going to need to be switched off at times. It's not going to be as straightforward as like losing all of our experience to the AI box, because we still need to be able to fight in a place where we need to minimize our thermal signature. We have to switch the generators off. We have to switch the radios off. We have to like minimize movement and transportation. There's all sorts of ways in which the human will reassert itself over the battlefield, and the technology will fade into a kind of one thing amongst many.
I mean, it's interesting.
So
You're suggesting that, to put it in its general terms, that the silent mode button will be pressed at some point. I mean, I'm asking these questions because, a lot of people don't really understand and I don't, to be honest. I know some of it, but I don't really know what artificial intelligence is going to mean in the long run. But I think we have to ask the questions like, I have done it, devil's advocate scenario, because a new ideas come along, so we have to ask the difficult questions. But I
yes,
think what you've been able to tell us in your paper and in the discussion we've had is that it's not all one way. I think there's a big fear in people, and it seems to happen quite often now in recent times, that ChatGPT is somehow taking over the world, and you get broadcasters on television scaring everybody with it's the end of humanity as we know it, and round the corner a robot's going to kill us all, and blah blah blah, all that rubbish. And I think what you're saying is there's a more rational approach to how we a perceive artificial intelligence, and b how we work with it to our benefit.
I think it's to our benefit is the important thing, because noting that we're talking narrowly about warfare, the impact of artificial intelligence in the wider economy is starting to make itself felt in terms of like de-skilling or kind of loss of particular jobs. The jobs market is changing as a result of AI. And I think coming back to a point I made a lot earlier, I think we need to be careful that AI, that trend in the wider economy, isn't reflected within communities that we would rather wasn't affected by, i.e. the military, right? So we don't want to de-skill our leaders. We don't want to de-skill our soldiers. We don't want to de-skill our analysts. What we want to do is be able to look at this thing and say it's of service to us and we can adapt to it and use it in effective ways, but we don't want to take, we need to be cognizant of the other consequences of it and push back against those.
I think what concerns me, and it goes back to the idea of somebody who's only ever lived with apps and smartphones, and sooner or later they're going to be in a position of authority. What kind of concerns me is you know, I go out and sit in a library and everyone's playing on their smartphone. I go to university and you sat in a seminar room and everyone's playing on their smartphone. And my impression is there is a huge disconnect between younger society that has been trained to read and write and do arithmetic, you know, that terribly boring stuff, which has got them to a level where they can make a choice. And those that now, admitting at the age of 10, 12, 13, 14, whatever, that they can no longer write, their mathematics or their arithmetic is not very good, and they don't read books. And that concerns me because a lot of books, if they're not digitized, don't go on the smartphone.
Yeah.
I'm addressing a young parent here with
I mean
huge issues.
that's a whole other thing. I mean, yes, I think my my boys are 3 and 12 weeks respectively, and so there's a lot of time before I have to worry, thank God, about the smartphone adoption. But I know that there is some kids around here where I live that I've seen kids like, very like 5,
Totally.
primary school age with smartphones. And given that I've had my my career history has taken me through things like looking at social media in for various types of analysis, I'm kind of wary of, I'm predisposed to be wary of the effect of the smartphone or, access to social media. So that's something which my other half and I have already agreed that is a solid no until they're kind of voting age or much further into the future. That's an argument we're going to have. But like, I don't agree with the idea of giving kids free reign. I mean, I grew up much pre-mobile phone as well, so I have the kind of luxury of having had that buffer of time before I got exposed to information tech in a big way, and I'd like to give my son the benefit of that as well. I don't know whether that's just me being, again, like, is this just an older generation reflecting on the younger generation without fully understanding? But I just don't look at TikTok and the way in which apps are designed to kind of hold your attention on the device. I don't look at that positively. And as you say, it's, rates of literacy are declining. I saw the paper the other day that was talking about kids, particularly I think it was in America, just don't read for fun anymore because they scroll instead. And all of those things, they do feel like bad stuff. They feel like bad things to me. That doesn't feel like me just being a bit of an old fart going, "Rrr." That feels like a bad thing. So I kind of agree that at some point there's going to be a reckoning where we're going to have to like manage the interests of keeping people fixed on the smartphone with the actual societal need to make sure people are properly educated and and read and are encouraged to read for pleasure, because that's important for interactions with people, not just learning stuff.
Well, Rupert, um, thank you very much. You've already given us your 5 minute book review, which will go up in parallel with this. Thank you
Great.
very much for your time. Um, and we'll there'll be no doubt opportunities to come on again and discuss because we're thinking of having a discussion circle. I'm all waiting for Ben to come back, who's still sadly ill. But if we get a discussion group going, then we can have informed discussions, not just on military subjects, but artificial intelligence, histories, and all sorts of things. So um, thank you very much for your advanced ideas and actually being quite open and honest on your paper that you've brought to us from the Alan Turing Institute. And people should have a look at that on the web page. And again, thank you very much for joining us.
Very welcome, and thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's great to catch up and great to chat.
Always, always.